My last time in the book of Esther looked at Mordecai and his overhearing of the plot against the king, and how that he went to Esther to tell her what's going on and basically saved the king's life, but was not rewarded for that. The king forgot to do anything for him. And that's God working behind the scenes, obviously, as we see later on, how that this works into God's perfect plan. How that things go on in our lives sometimes, and we feel like God's not blessing us, but God knows when to bless us. He knows when to answer prayer, and it's not always when we think that it is. As the old song goes, God may not be here when you want Him, but He's always right on time. And so God answers prayer on time here. So Mordecai here does warn the king, but unfortunately later on, we do see Ahasuerus later on would be assassinated. However, at this point in time, God had a purpose. And then we find Haman, who became basically prime minister at this time. Oftentimes in these kingdoms, and we saw that with Egypt, how that Joseph went into Egypt, as you recall, and ended up being imprisoned, wrongly confused of inappropriate actions with Potiphar's wife, and then later rose to great power over the kingdom. And then later on in the history of Egypt, we find that Egypt imprisons the descendants of Joseph, the relatives of Joseph. Why did they do that? Well, you talk about the fact that the new Pharaoh didn't know Joseph, but didn't remember what all that they did for the history of the nation. But what was going on in Egypt at that time, the background for imprisoning the Jews, is that there's a word called Hyksos, H-Y-K-O-S. Yeah, H-Y-K-O-S, yeah. Which meant foreign rulers. And what happened in Egypt is they did allow certain foreign rulers to come into place, as Joseph had done. But others had come into place. And before long, the Egyptians got to worrying about this, that there are more foreign rulers than before, and it may not be too long before they take over. And so there was basically a kind of a patriotic revival, if you want to call it that, within Egypt, where they kicked out all the foreign rulers. And then they started looking around thinking, okay, we won't let the foreigners rule over us, but what about the Israelites? Their numbers are so great that they could end up taking over. And so what we need to do is to imprison them. And they did imprison them, made slaves out of them to keep them down. And then, of course, God would send in Moses to let the people go. Well, so it wasn't uncommon in those days for foreigners to become rulers. We know, of course, Daniel became a ruler under Nebuchadnezzar, and then even Cyrus and Darius later on, when the Persian king Cyrus and the king of the Medes Darius came into power. Remember, it was Darius who gave the order to throw anybody into the lion's den that didn't worship or that prayed to anybody else other than him. And so, but it broke his heart that Daniel ended up being thrown in the lion's den. He didn't realize exactly what he had done at that time by making that rule. He was tricked by some of the people. So again, common in those days. Well, here in this time, even though Esther and Mordecai and even more likely Haman was there because of captivity, throughout the times of the captivity, not initially when they first went in, but over the years, they began to rise to power. And so even though they were a foreigner, they had some authority. And of course, Haman took great advantage of that. Referred to him as Haman the haughty. Scriptures tell us that pride cometh before destruction, and a haughty spirit before the fall. And this very much describes Haman. His pride, his haughtiness, his animosity towards the things of God and anything else. Remember, he was an Agagite, also an Amalekite. Agag being very specific, a descendant of King Agag here. And then he was the one who Saul was supposed to kill and spared his life. Of course, Samuel does kill him, but the point being is that Saul's command was to completely get rid of all the Amalekites, and he failed in that. They had been enemies since the wilderness journey, and so they'd constantly been a thorn in the flesh to Israel, and so God commanded their destruction at that time. Exodus 17 says, "The Lord said to Moses, write this for a memorial in a book, rehearse it in the ears of Joshua, for I will utterly put out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven." Of course, we talked about this last week, but just to give you a reminder here of who these people are and why they're in this, why they want to do what they want to do. Last verse here, that thou blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. Thou shalt not forget it. So again, the importance here of following God's command. And of course, Haman, very proudful, rose to power, but he was the type of person who didn't earn respect, he demanded respect. He demanded to be honored. And of course, the background he had with Israel, knowing what the Israelites had done to his people, the Amalekites, and to his probably great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, whatever it would have been, Agag, a descendant of Agag, he hated the Jews. But not only the Jews, he still demanded respect from others. And so we find here, first of all, it says, "And when Haman saw that Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence, then was Haman full of wrath. And he thought scorn to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had shown him the people of Mordecai." So he hated him, then he found out, this guy's a Jew. Therefore his anger was even more kindled against him. So wherefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews that throughout the kingdom of Ahasuerus, even the people of Mordecai. And so, of course, this is Haman's great mistake here. Go back again, mention it so many times. Genesis chapter 12, the Abrahamic covenant. "I will bless them that bless thee, and curse them that curse thee." You know, Babylon prospered because of Daniel's presence and the Lord's presence. Ahasuerus here would prosper as long as the Jews were there. But to turn against them meant certain judgment. And so this would have happened to the whole country if Haman was allowed to complete his plan. The blessing will come if we honor. The judgment will come if we disobey. And then he lied, of course, and that's so often the case, of course, with these. Haman couldn't find anything that Mordecai did wrong, could not find anything that the Jews did wrong, other than the fact that I know who the Jews are, therefore I want to kill them all. And Haman said unto the king Ahasuerus, he doesn't mention them by name. He doesn't go into specifics. But one thing that Haman knows, that if I can get the king to make this law, then there's nothing that can be done to stop it. At least that was his belief. And probably the belief of most of the people, and end up being the belief of the king. The king thought, okay, well, I did make this law, and so nobody can stop the law, even the king. What we refer to as the laws of the Medes and Persians. So he says there's a certain people, I'm not going to tell you who they are, but there's a certain people scattered abroad, dispersed among the people in all the provinces of that kingdom. He says their laws are diverse, or they're different from ours. They're different from everybody's, from all people, he said. Neither keep they the king's laws. Of course, these are all lies, but again, he's not being too specific, so it could be challenged. So he's just saying there's a certain people. Therefore, it's not for the king's profit to allow them or to suffer them. If you remember last week, talked about he offered to pay 10,000 talents of silver, and of course the king ended up rejecting it. So no, he said, I tell you what, you're doing me a favor here. You're telling me about enemies against me. You keep your money. In fact, I'll actually reward you. So don't worry about it. Just help me in taking care of these. And so they sat down, chapter 3, verse 15, they relaxed, deciding what they want to do, and they decided to announce a day of execution, that all the Jews would be killed, or a time of execution, not necessarily just a single day, but a time of execution, that all the Jews would be killed. And they cast lots to determine, okay, is it this month? No. Is it this month? No. And it goes on down the line to end up being the 12th month. So God here obviously has a plan and gives them the longest amount of time possible before the executions take place. So there's a law given. The news went out, the post went out, telling everybody what's going to happen. And in fact, many of the people are really troubled by this. Not just the Jews, obviously, who are troubled, but it says the city of Shushan, which is a capital city, was perplexed about this. They wondered, why, King, would you allow for this? These people living among us are not doing us any harm. But I'm sure some saw it as a way of benefit, that if I can kill my Jewish neighbor, then I can have everything that he has. I can take it in as my own. So I'm sure there's some in that regard. But for the most part, it says that the whole city was perplexed. They're troubled by this. Why would you allow this to take place? Of course, Mordecai, very much troubled. And like I said, I know we've talked about this last week, but it's such an important passage here that I want you to continue to think about, is what did happen in these circumstances here with Mordecai. His first thoughts were, we need to go to the king. We need to tell him what's going on, but we need to make sure that we do the right thing. Here he is troubled, the plight here. It goes into deep mourning. At this point in time, Esther still really doesn't know what's going on at the time. She's living in the palace. The people are troubled here. Mordecai is in great mourning. And because of this, there was a law that if you are troubled or in mourning, you can't enter into the city. And so Mordecai could not go in and get to Esther, so he had to send a messenger in. And he informed her that she needed to go to the king immediately. You need to stop this going on here. In Esther chapter 4, 1 through 3. But you need to put a stop. Mordecai told him of all that had happened to him and of some of the money that Haman had promised. So he told the whole story here to the messenger. The messenger, Hatak, ends up going to Esther and repeating everything back. Hatak wasn't in mourning, but Mordecai was. Also, Esther also knowing the standards of the day, that anybody to go in unannounced to the king could face certain death. If the king decided that person could live, he had that right at this point. But if the king decided not, well, the person died. Even though Esther is queen, she still understands that she's under the same rules as the people are. And then this statement here we talked about last week, but such a great statement, a reminder to Esther, and maybe should be a reminder to us, that we're where we are in this world for a reason. I believe we're in our neighborhoods for a reason. And there's a commercial on TV, and I'm really not sure what it's for, as most commercials are. Who knows what they're for? But it starts off with zip codes appearing on the screen. And it talks about, when you were born, if you were born in a different zip code, your life may have been completely different. Kind of interesting commercial. It might be YMCA or whatever it is, Boys Club, I don't know. But whatever it is. It does talk about being born in different places in the world, how different your life would be. And, that is something to think about, to be honest with you. But where you are to be, I believe, should be directed by God. And if you follow the will of God, God will put you where you need to be. And if you're where you need to be, it's because it's important. Whatever ministry that you have, you might sit back and think, well, somebody can perform this ministry much better than I can. It doesn't matter if anybody can do it better or if everybody does it worse. It doesn't make any difference. What matters is God put you in that place, in that Sunday school class, as that teacher or minister or whatever, for a reason. And how do you know that that reason is extremely important? Because as Mordecai tells Esther, he says, think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews, for if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then God's going to send in deliverance from someplace. See, Mordecai knew Genesis 12. Mordecai knew the Abrahamic covenant. He knew that God's people would survive. So he's not really worried about that. He's not worried about what Haman's going to exterminate all the Jews that ever are. He knew better than that. What he's concerned about is for his own family, himself, and for Esther. And he reminds her, he said, how do you know that you haven't come to the kingdom for such a time as this? So, Esther, the reason you're a queen is because God put you there. And if God put you there, then it's important that you be there. And why are you there? Well, maybe this is the reason. Maybe this is the main reason. It's because God put you there so that you could be the one to go to the king and he accepts you into his presence and allows you to live, and then you can tell him what's going on. Well, that's exactly what did happen, isn't it? That Esther was there in the right place. And so wherever you're at right now in your ministry, how do you know you didn't come to that ministry for such a time as this? To be the one to be an impact upon that student or that person or that soul or whatever it might be. God's put you there for a reason. And God does not put people in our path for us to walk around them. He puts people in our path for a reason. And that's to be an encourager and to be encouraged, to serve and to be served or whatever. But they're there for a reason. And we cannot just pass that off as though it's just a coincidence, because it's not. Mordecai knew enlargement and deliverance would come from someplace else. So the two phrases here, deliverance arrives to the Jews from another place. Also, Esther's impact upon the Jews, very important, because later on that would matter even for, as we will go back and complete the book of Ezra, how the first 6 chapters, Ezra wasn't born, but when it comes time for Ezra to go back to Jerusalem, the influence of Esther upon him. Of course, doesn't mean that Esther is not in a predicament. Remember the personality of Esther. If you had to find a person that met the personality of Esther, there's plenty out there. You might be one of them, whether male or female, that you might, be humble and shy, a little bit afraid maybe to approach someone. Therefore, what do? Well, what did Esther do? She asked for prayer. She sought the guidance of God before she went in, and then God gave her the courage to go in. So she orders a 3-day fast. Now, this is important because even though the name of God is not mentioned in the book of Esther, and obviously God is referenced here in this fast, go back to Isaiah chapter 58 to find out what a fast is. A fast is a time of service. A fast is a time of doing things. A fast is a time of giving of yourself, of your time, of your resources. It talks about giving clothing to others, giving food, giving shelter to others. Fasting is not about, the important thing is not that you, or that you don't eat. That's not the important thing. Is that a part of fasting? Well, yeah, I mean, that's what the word fast means, but in and of itself. But the doctrine of fasting is far more than abstaining from food. I mean, people abstain from food today for dieting purposes, and that has nothing to do with any spiritual matters at all. But fasting is about doing. Again, Isaiah 58, God said, this is a fast. He said, first of all, you unloose your burdens, you unloose your weakness. You get your life right with me first. And you break the bonds that are holding you back. And you get your heart right. And then, during the time of fasting, you are serving. It's not a time for personal benefit of any way. It's a time when husband and wife abstain from the physical relationship of a marriage, and until for a certain time, as the New Testament teaches us that you do it only for a certain amount of time. You abstain for a certain amount of time. But the importance there of purifying yourself and not serving yourself, not doing anything for yourself. During a fast, you don't sit down and watch a ball game. You don't sit around and do anything. During that fast, it's about service to other people. And then when you're not around those people during the fast, it's time of praying, time of inner reflection to make sure that you are where God would have you to be. And so Esther asked for this. He orders a 3-day fast. Now, can you do that? Can you ask and order other people to fast? Well, yes, you can. However, it's important to note that whether the people do it or not is up to them. You know, if a person had been fasting for several days and then he goes to church and the church states a great issue coming up and several in the church says, well, we need to really pray and fast about this, and then they ask you, would you join with me in this fast? You might have to say no. You know, at that point in time, you don't believe that's what God would have you to do because you just came off a fast. So there's nothing wrong with asking for other people to fast. What we sometimes is referred to as corporate fasting, where we include other people into our prayer circle, other people into our fasting. But remember, you can't make people fast. All right. So you make sure that you can ask people. Esther asked people, but very importantly, she goes on to say, "Go into the king, which is not according to law." And she said, "If I perish, I perish." So Esther did not know the results of her going to the king, even though she knew she had a righteous cause before God. She knew that she could die. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego knew very well that they could die that day. And they told the king, God can deliver us from this. But if we're not, well, we perish. That's okay. And I always say, looking back, the reality of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the worst thing that could have happened to them that day is exactly what did happen, is that they lived. Because remember, if they had died, where would they have went? Absent from body, present with the Lord. So that's not a drop in standards by any means. That's a great benefit. However, God had a purpose for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and allowed them to live. God had a purpose for Esther. I mean, here she says, if I perish, I perish. If I die, well, I've got to do what God wants me to do. If it costs me my life, then so be it. And so that's a great thing. I mentioned before, as you may recall, two different prophets went to two different kings and rebuked the king on their adultery. And the first one was Nathan. Nathan went to David, and David, as king, had the authority to put anybody to death. David didn't put Nathan to death, did he? And what he did was he accepted the rebuke, and he repented of his ways. He confessed his sin. The other prophet who went to a king, John the Baptist. And he went to the king to tell the king what he was doing was wrong, living in sin. And we know what happened. The king didn't really want it to happen, but he gave in to Salome, his niece, and who was dancing whatever this probably sexual dance was in front of him. And said, what do you want? I'll give it to you. And of course, he said, give me the head of John the Baptist on a charger. And John died, was executed for just telling the truth. Why did God allow one prophet to live and one prophet to die? Well, remember John's job? What did John call, or what did God call John into the ministry to do? And that was to bring in the tidings of Christ, to be the forerunner of Christ. And like I've always said, in class, we've talked about this, I know, but very important for us to remember these things. John's job was done. Once the speaker announces, once the person announces the speaker, his job is to sit down. Well, John announced Jesus, and it was time for him to sit down. And God took him home. And we find that a horrible thing, the death of John, for simply doing the right thing. And as a human being, yes, it is a horrible thing. But as a child of God, it's not so bad. John got to go to heaven. So Esther here realized, if I die, well, I die. And so 3 days later, Esther was received by the king. She goes in, then the king said to her, what will thou, Queen Esther? And what is thy request? And it shall be given thee to half the kingdom. Well, what a calmness or release probably in Esther's mind, not knowing what's going to happen. I'm going to the king today, and I'm going to do what God wants me to do. If I perish, I perish. And the king says, hey, whatever you want, I'll give you half my kingdom. And so what a great feeling it must have been for Esther that day. I imagine there were some tears shed by Esther. Just knowing her personality from the scriptures, I'm pretty sure there were tears shed, tears of joy, how that God answered her prayer, Mordecai's prayer, and the people of Israel's prayer as she went into the king. Esther didn't come right out immediately and state what the issue was. And it may be because of her shyness. It may be that she was just led by God to wait, because God has a plan in this. Could have been numerous different reasons, but as the story turns out, we know this obviously was the right thing to do. And so she asked the king to let a banquet be held for her, the king, and Haman. Well, Haman here, man, he ate this up. This is great. Haman didn't know the relationship of Esther and Mordecai. He really didn't understand who she was. All he knew was she's the queen and the king, and I'm going to be in the presence of them. So as far as everybody's concerned, I'm the number one man here now. The king wants me. The queen wants me. Haman here refrained himself from this, but when he goes out, of course, what happens? Here he's all excited. I'm going to the banquet. Nobody else is invited. He goes out in the street and sees Mordecai, and Mordecai still doesn't bow down to him. And so all this pride of being the chosen one at the banquet, man, it just hits him hard. And it just frustrates him all the more. And so he calls his friends together and his wife together to tell them of what's going on. Tell them the great victory. Hey, by the way, the king invited me to dinner, and the queen. But also to tell of his frustration. This is great, but man, that Mordecai, he just blew it. He blew everything from me. I was so happy, and he just took all of it from me. I was just so mad at Mordecai here. He says, Haman told them of the glory of his riches and the multitude of his children and all things wherein the king had promoted him, how he had advanced him above the princes and the servants of the king. Haman said, moreover, yes, Esther, the queen, did let no man come in with the king unto the banquet that she had prepared but myself. And tomorrow I am invited unto her, also with the king. And then that one sentence that takes all the joy from this. Yet all this avails me nothing so long as I see Mordecai, the Jew, sitting at the king's gate. Man, wife, friends, I got all this, but Mordecai, he is just another thorn in the flesh to me. So his wife says, well, Haman, you going before the king? The king found favor with you. Esther, the queen, found favor with you. Tell you what you need to do. You go in, tell the king about Mordecai, and have him hanged. So she suggests to her husband, Haman, to build a gallows. And tomorrow, it'll be all ended. Mordecai will be dead. You'll be raised up in the kingdom. You'll be honored by all the people. And what a great thing to take place. Of course, we know the story, don't we? Haman's plot backfires. He builds the gallows. Just a huge, huge structure. And now he's got some hope. And he goes back in chapter 6. That night, he said, why did Esther delay from telling the king when she first went in? Well, here's the reason, although she may not have realized it. God made the king so where he could not sleep that night. And by doing this, the king needed to do something to fall asleep, so he couldn't turn on the radio. What'd he do? Well, he asked for the records of the kings. And he called for the records of kings, one to come forth. And he said, read these things to me. And I figured I'd probably fall asleep being bored by all this that's going on here. Well, couldn't sleep. In chapter 6, verse 1, Mordecai had saved the king's life. Story of Bigthan and Teresh here. How they plotted against him. And the king thought about this and said, you know what, did I do anything for that Mordecai? He saved my life. And of course, he said, what honor and dignity has been done to Mordecai for this? And the king's servants that ministered him said, well, king, actually, nothing's been done for him. Well, here's the story, isn't it? The providence of God, provisions here for Mordecai, for Esther, and for the children of Israel. Haman arrived at the palace, wanted to see the king, also wanted to have permission to have Mordecai hanged on the gallows. But the king here says, so Haman came into the king, and the king said to him, what shall be done? And I love this. This is, you gotta laugh. I know actually it's a horrible story because somebody dies in this, but just the irony here of what takes place. As the king ask Haman of all people, ask his advice. What shall be done if the man whom the king delights to honor? Haman can only think of one person that fit that category, and that was himself, because of his pride. So he thought in his heart, to whom would the king delight to do honor more than to myself? Haman here didn't know what the king was talking about. He thought he did, and he surely did not. And so he said, well, I tell you, king, this is what you need to do. Clothe the man with one of your own royal robes. And here, I mean, look at the pride, the arrogance here of Haman, because he thought, well, this is me. What do you want to? What would should you do to this man? Well, since it's me, Lord, let me have one. Let the man have one of your garments, one of your royal robes, and in fact, place him upon your own horse, king. In fact, let him wear the crown. Here's someone, that needs to be honored. Here's, that's me, of course, I'm thinking, Haman thought. And then let one of the king's sons, the most noble of your sons, lead the person through the streets. We don't know who it is, but lead the person through the city streets, and have the people shout praises to him. So what an arrogant statement here by Haman, believing that that I'm going to be the one. King liked what Haman had to say, and basically turned to Haman and said, "Hey, make it so." Offered him, though, look what in chapter 6, and Haman here finds out that the one to be honored is Mordecai. Oh man, this is the end. I mean, Haman's already mad at Mordecai anyway. Totally humiliated. He runs home to his friends and family to find that nobody really cares. Haman told Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that had befallen him. Then said his wise men and Zeresh, his wife, unto him, if Mordecai be of the seeds of the Jews, for whom thou hast begun to fall, thou shalt not prevail against him, but shalt surely fall before him. While they yet spoke, he received the message to attend Esther's second banquet. So here he went to the king to tell the king about Mordecai, leaves in frustration. Now it's time for the banquet. Oh man. And Mordecai is to be honored, and Mordecai is my arch nemesis. I don't know what's going to happen here. Well, next week we'll continue the story here. What a great story this is in the book of Esther. And we will talk again next week.